Welcome on this wonderfully sunny day where we're going to be looking and taking a deep dive into the Trump-MAGA wrestling takedown of Harvard University. Harvard's motto, Veritas. And as we know, the Romans said, in vino veritas, in wine there is truth. So we are going to be drinking a bit of Donald's wine, his MAGA Donald Plunk Vintage 2025, to see if we can arrive at his Veritas. So in MAGA Donald Plunk Veritas. And just to give a bit of plug to this vintage, since Donald is so intent on making money on the presidency, and in accordance with his cryptocurrency and along the lines of his Trump University and Trump stakes, let us put in a plug for the MAGA Donald Plunk Vintage 2025. It's miraculously made. And remember, save the very best for last. It's also the plunk that is literally drunk to a stupor by most journalists. Welcome to Pillar on Politics, Context Cubed. I'm Bob Pillar, and this is where mere context is not enough. We need context, context, context. Context is often too narrow, too out of focus, lacking depth, selective. So what we need to do is add to that, is to build that context into what I call context cubed. And in the lunacy of American politics and trying to explain American politics, can we do that? And yes, I believe we can by providing this context cubed. So what is this context cubed consist of? The first and very major premise is that the Trump-MAGA Republican Party, at its core, at its very essence, at its beating heart, is a white Christian nationalist, white supremacist party. And this is very important. This is my main premise. Every Trump-MAGA phenomenon can be explained by using a white Christian nationalist, white supremacy lens. And we're going to use the Harvard case to see if this can hold true. But this isn't the only context. We need more context to build. The additional context, the Democrats, Democratic leaders, and the left liberal Democratic pundit class have blinders on and thus cannot see the obvious evidence that the MAGA Republican Party is this white Christian nationalist, white supremacist party. Right? This blinder, this inability to see this is leaving the vast majority of Democrats clueless as to what is happening politically in their own country, and the media is doing a woeful job to understand this, and we will look at this also in this video. So, what is this white Christian nationalist, white supremacist lens? I hold that there are four biblical tenets of white Christian nationalism. As we can see from the pictures, the declaration is Jesus is my savior, Trump is my president. It is believed that Trump has been preordained to be the representative on earth of white Christian nationalism. So, these four tenets. The first, and I would say the most important: blacks have evil souls. This is a consequence of the belief of an extended curse of Ham. The curse of Ham is a curse in the Bible where the descendants of Ham are condemned to forever be slaves and servants. It is not said in the Bible, but it has been held and believed by many that part of the curse was the darkening of the skin, and that these people have flawed or even evil souls, criminal souls. This is the most important biblical story in American history, and I will be spending in the future some time in other videos on this. Right. The second tenet: men dominate, women are to be submissive. And the third, anyone who is not heterosexual is an abomination. This explains the anti-LGBTQ sentiments of white Christian nationalism. The fourth is the New Testament prophecy that in order, or as a precursor for the second coming of Christ, biblical Israel must be resurrected. White Christian nationals are not 100% in favor of Israel. They are 500, 1,000, 2,000% supportive of Israel. This is not to say that they like Jews. They hate Jews. Jews killed Christ. But as far as New Testament prophecy goes, the resurrection of Israel is necessary before Christ can come back. I would also add a fifth tenet, which is anti-Muslim. Now, Muslims, of course, do not appear in the New Testament, but Islam and Christianity has been fighting for a long, long time. And, war of holy books, why would you want to waste a good holy book war? So these are the 5 tenets, 4 plus 1, of white Christian nationalism and white supremacy in the United States. A feature of the culture wars is the oft-stated assertion that there are coastal elites who are liberal, woke, educated, and condescending and arrogant towards those Americans, those real Americans, those real American patriots who live in the heartlands. And then I just take a look at this, and something becomes immediately obvious. This is the president of Harvard who, along with other university presidents, was hauled in front of Congress to testify about the pro-Palestinian, pro-Gazan, anti-Israeli protests on campuses. So this happened in December 2023. And as I see this, I'm going to slip into my MAGA rage brain and see what do I see. 4 university presidents were called in front of Congress to testify. What can we see? All 4 are women. And thinking back on the white Christian nationalist tenets, men dominate, women are to be submissive. So these are East Coast liberal woke women. And if I'm a MAGA in my MAGA rage brain, what do I see? DEI higher, DEI higher, DEI higher, DEI higher. These people are to be submissive and are not to be leading. One of the tenets of white Christian nationalism met. But there's an even more obvious one, isn't there? Right? And that's President Claudine Gay, who is black. And remember the most important tenet of white Christian nationalism. Blacks have evil souls. And what do we need to do? We need to somehow get rid of her. And indeed, this process, this testifying, she is now the ex-president of Harvard. We got her. Another tenet met. But look at this. Nemat Minouche Shafik. There is a suspicious name. And in fact, Ms. Shafik was born in Egypt, although she came to the United States as a very young girl, and therefore is completely Americanized. But that name is suspicious, and that origin, right? So we can bring to bear, why not, our anti-Muslim aspect and our anti-Muslim tenet. Right? So here we have met another one. We've got 3 of the 5. And here's 4 out of 5, right? Because the whole thing, this whole exercise was about Israel. And one of the tenets of white Christian nationalism is that biblical Israel must be resurrected as a precursor for the second coming of Christ. And this map here, the map of Israel in the New Testament, exactly points to that. And we know that the ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, a white Christian nationalist, talks about not Israel, but about Samaria and Judea as it was in the time of Christ. So here we have a fourth tenet employed in this situation. The only one we're missing is the LGBTQ aspect. Now, I don't know what the private lives of any of these four people are, but I'm sure if it was otherwise, that we could add that and we could possibly see all the tenets coming together. But this is a good case where we can see white Christian nationalism at work. The result was President Gay, gone. President of the University of Pennsylvania, gone. Right? The president of Columbia, Dr. Shafiq, gone. We got 3 out of the 4 as far as I know. The fourth from MIT is still president. But what a success, pow, 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 of white Christian nationalism. Let's listen to a snippet from an interview with Christiane Amanpour, where she's interviewing a professor of government from Harvard, Professor Stephen Levitsky.
Said yesterday. I mean, we know that the administration claims that all this is about anti-Semitism, combating anti-Semitism. We also know that Harvard, even, last year and beyond, have taken measures against anti-Semitism and apparently DEI. Trump has also pulled, as we've talked about, billions in federal grants and the latest he's doing with international students. Do you believe that that is what this is all about? And then
no, absolutely, I do not believe that this is not about anti-Semitism. It's not about DEI. These are pretexts. Authoritarian governments, we need to be very clear. This is an authoritarian government that is using the machinery of government, the state, as a weapon to punish, to bully, to silence business, media, law firms, universities, and other elements of civil society. So this is part of a much broader attack on American democracy. Autocrats go after universities. Autocrats, left-wing autocrats, centrist autocrats, right-wing autocrats. It's hard to find an autocratic government that does not go after universities. And they always find a pretext. Sometimes it's terrorism, sometimes it's communism. In this case, Trump is using anti-Semitism. But we know that there are more anti-Semites in the Trump administration.
And as Professor Levitsky said, the anti-Semitism accusation against Harvard was merely a pretext, and as I was a bit of camouflage, very, very weak, very easily see-through camouflage. But really, it was about expressing the white Christian nationalist support for Israel, being pro-Israeli, right? And as Levitsky said, there are more anti-Semites in the Trump administration than at Harvard. Absolutely true. All we have to see is reflect on Charlottesville 2017. It's the day when Trump revealed himself to be the white supremacist in chief. There was absolutely no doubt of this, right? And he had the chance to combat anti-Semitism when the marchers, those right-wing marchers, many of them armed and organized as pseudo-militias, chanted, "The Jews shall not replace us." And let us not forget, Trump's daughter is Jewish. She converted to marry Jared Kushner, his favorite daughter, Ivanka, the daughter he wanted to have sex with, as he said in an interview, right? Even then, he couldn't stand up and make a statement against anti-Semitism. So we know from this, right, from his statement, that there were fine people on both sides, right? We know that the anti-Semitism charges against Harvard were merely political pretext and camouflage. Now, let's take a look at a Fareed Zakaria commentary on Trump's war on Harvard.
The Trump administration's war on Harvard is bizarre in many ways. Claiming to be about fighting anti-Semitism, it has demanded that the university cede control over large parts of its academic affairs and hand over private information about its international students. It's never explained why it has singled out Harvard for this retribution.
So one thing Zakaria says is, why was Harvard singled out? Has Harvard been singled out, really? I mean, quickly we can establish that, yes, Harvard is the most prominent, the one most prominently in the news, being attacked, the way it's being attacked. But they're not the only ones. Brown, Columbia, Cornell, Northwestern, Penn, Princeton, and you can add up the billions of dollars worth of research grants being threatened to be withheld or have been withheld. And then it goes on. George Washington, Johns Hopkins, NYU, Northwestern, 3 universities, state universities in California, Berkeley, UCLA. University of Southern California is private, so 2 state universities are private one, as well as the University of Minnesota, public university in Minnesota. So I find Zakaria's statement that Harvard is being singled out as a bit of a clueless statement. So, if that's the case with Harvard being singled out, Zakaria further goes on to say, there's no reason for the retribution. Let's examine this. And this, again, is part of my argument that, in general, the media, people who get paid very well, are somehow missing on what the story really is. And this is a disservice to the country, to their listeners and readers. And, my question is, does the white Christian nationalist, white supremacist filter work? So we're going to apply it here, right? No reason for the retribution? Well, we will give a reason. And the reason we are looking at is applying the lens of white Christian nationalism, white supremacy. Let's go to the source. So one of the first sources we're going to look at is this letter from the United States Department of Education, Office for Civil Rights. And civil rights was one of the main pillars, one of the main missions established for the department when it was created by Congress. This letter dates from February 14th, 2025, so Trump was pretty newly in office and he was inaugurated about 3 weeks before. And it starts out, discrimination on the basis of race, color, or national origin is illegal and morally reprehensible. Yeah, I can agree with that, and I think pretty much most everyone should be able to agree with that. And it establishes this on the basis of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Equal Protection Clause of the United States Constitution. And then the letter becomes accusatory, that American educational institutions have discriminated against students on the basis of race. Now, looking through the white Christian nationalist, white supremacist lens, I am expecting to see or to hear about reverse discrimination, discrimination against whites, and the increasing erosion of white rights in the country. And there it is. Discrimination against white students. It goes on to say that these institutions embrace pervasive and repugnant race-based preferences. The previous letter was written by the acting secretary, and then Trump's nominee was confirmed by the Senate, and that nominee is Linda McMahon. She was a World Wrestling executive. Her husband founded some World Wrestling association, which I guess Trump is associated with, and I think they've known each other for quite some long time. So here's Ms. McMahon. We hope that this is not staged, although we know that it is. Wrestling Professional wrestling is, of course, a form of theater. And everything is scripted. So, but as a form of theater, why not? Theater is scripted. So why not? This is theater with lots of action. It was written on May 5th, 2025, and the letter is so belligerent, it's so accusatory, it's so over the top. It can only have been written or drafted or dictated by Donald Trump himself. And addressed to the president of Harvard, and accuses Harvard of a systemic pattern of violating federal law. So this is pretty serious. And what is behind that? I mean, it talks about the foreign students and asking why there's so much hate on the campus. Where do these people come from? That Harvard has made a mockery of this country's higher education system. It has invited foreign students who engage in violent behavior and show contempt for the United States of America. Let's say that again. They're showing contempt for the United States of America. I thought it was about anti-Semitism. Where is anti-Semitism mentioned in this letter? Nowhere. And it just serves to show that the anti-Semitism accusation against these universities was, as Professor Levitsky said, a pretext. Right? And really, it was substituting anti-Semitism for being pro-Israeli, one of the tenets of white Christian nationalism. And as I said, it's over the top, attacking Harvard's disastrous mismanagement. But the most important thing, and says most alarmingly, Harvard has failed to abide by the United States Supreme Court ruling demanding that it end its racial preferencing. I think, Mr. Zakaria, we are getting here through our white Christian nationalist lens why there is retribution against Harvard. The accusation is that they are not abiding by a United States Supreme Court ruling and continue to engage in ugly racism against universities, against the students. And again, we know from the white Christian nationalist lens that this means reverse discrimination against whites. It tells Harvard, don't bother applying for grants, you're not going to get any, this withholding these billions of dollars. And again, the letter, the tone of the letter, which is signed by Linda McMahon as Secretary of Education, the tone of the letter is so belligerent, just so, over the top. The way it reads, the way it sounds, it can only come from one person. So what is this Supreme Court case? And, of course, easy to find, and I don't know to what extent, could do research to what extent the press reported about this. I imagine to good extent. But for some reason, in the recent reporting on this attack on Harvard, nothing I saw mentioned the Supreme Court case, except for this Department of Education letter. So let's look at this case. The case was considered in the October term, 2022, and it involved the Students for Fair Admissions, Inc. versus the President and Fellows of Harvard College. As we will see, the University of North Carolina was also included, though they're not in the title, but it was basically against Harvard College. It was decided in June 2023, and this is a very important date, so let's remember this date. We'll be coming back to it. So what was this case about? The question that the Supreme Court considered was whether the admission system used by Harvard was lawful or is lawful under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And just for good measure, the justices mentioned that in Harvard's admissions process, race is a determinative tip or factor for a significant percentage of all admitted African American and Hispanic applicants. This is an important statement which I will come back to. The principle that the Supreme Court is asserting is that eliminating racial discrimination means eliminating all of it. Very good principle. Who can argue with that? And it goes on to say that the law in the states shall be the same for the black as for the white, that all persons, whether colored or white, shall stand equal before the laws of the states. And this is quoting something from much earlier. And the Supreme Court decided, 6-3 decision. Of course, the three liberal justices dissented. And they decided that Harvard and University of North Carolina's admissions programs violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. So 6-3 decision. It was a 237-page case, so this is obviously very, very summary. But I think has the main points. And so now it considered a number of criteria as to how one determines whether or not racial criteria are being used fairly. To just focus it, I think, on the most important is that race should not be employed in a negative manner. That's the most important. And the Supreme Court held and found that Harvard's admissions programs lacked sufficient detail, focus, measurable objectives, which would justify the way they use race, and determined that in the absence of this, that they were indeed employing it in a negative manner, so in violation of constitutional rights of the Equal Protection Clause. So as we have seen, the decision came down in June 2023. So this letter here from May 2025 was a letter from the Education Department, as reported in the New York Times, informing Harvard that the Education Department will be investigating whether Harvard was in compliance or was racially discriminating against undergraduate applicants. So again, our white Christian nationalist lens is really becoming quite focused. And just as a reminder, I don't know if we need to have this, but it's always good. Actually, I find that not enough people are thinking enough about this. For Trump, civil rights protections should help white men. Right. Well, to underscore our theme that this is about reverse discrimination, let's look at something directly from Donald Trump, so going directly to the source, which is one of his executive orders, this one dating from April 25th, 2025, and entitled Reforming Accreditation to Strengthen Higher Education. I think we can get really to the crux and the essence of this when this executive order accuses accreditation agencies of, as part of their accreditation criteria, requiring diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI-based standards of accreditation. So again, here we come looking through our white Christian nationalist lens. And of course, the nice thing about DEI for them is that it covers three tenets of white Christian nationalism, which is blacks are inferior. Not only that, blacks are evil. Women are to be subordinated, and LGBTQ community is to be condemned. All three of those can get wrapped up in DEI. So we see this at work. So let's go hunting. In the Harvard class 2028, the incoming freshman class of 2024, we shall be looking for evidence of reverse discrimination. Does the Supreme Court have a point? Does MAGA have a point? Does Donald Trump have a point? Does my drinking his MAGA Donald Plunk lead to some semblance of veritas. To establish the context cubed, we're going to first look at the United States Census Bureau data. In July 2024, the population of the U.S. stood at 340.1 million people. Just 4 years earlier, it was 331.5, a difference of 8.6 million. In the 2010 census, the population stood at almost 309 million. So there was an increase of 31.4 million residents in the U.S., which underscores Trump's primary electoral issue, which was that of immigration, which led him to win 2 elections. We'll be talking about this in greater detail in an upcoming video. But let's look at the demographic breakdown. Whites comprise 75.3% of the population, but we have to be careful with this category. As we will see, there's a second white category, not including Hispanics, which means that the first category does include Hispanics who identify as white. So this white alone, not Hispanic, are 58.4% of the U.S. population. We can call this the Caucasians, or as Pat Buchanan called them in the 1990s, the Euro whites. These are the people directly descended from European immigrants. And that is a difference of almost 17% between these two white categories. This is worthy of looking in greater depth in another video to come. But we're going to focus now on the 58.4% representing the Euro whites. For the Hispanic, Latino population, they are at 19.5%. 20 years ago, it was about 9%. So this has grown tremendously. They have now overtaken Black Americans as the largest minority in the United States. The Blacks are standing at 13.7%, and then we have the Asian Americans at 6.4%. So these are the percentages, the breakdown of the U.S. population ethnically that we need to focus on. So whites, Euro whites, let's call them, 58.4%, Hispanics, 19.5%, Blacks, 13.7%, and finally, Asian Americans at 6.4%. Further, let's take a look at the demographic trend in college enrollment. So this chart goes from 1976 through 2022, again based on this is based on U.S. Department of Education data, and we can see that in 1976, the white part of the college enrollment stood at 84%, a bit over, but this has declined quite steadily over the decades and is now at 52.3%. And we compare it to the national representation of whites at 58.4%, we have to sort of stop for a second and say, actually, there is something going on in terms of a non-alignment of college enrollment reflecting the population as a whole. As we look at the Harvard class of 2028, the freshman class, the incoming class that entered in September 2024, I found this rather interesting fact. 1,647 students enrolled in 2024. This struck me at actually how small Harvard College really is. And just an interesting viewpoint here, they had 54,000 applications. So here we can really see how selective Harvard can be in their admissions. They have this tremendous luxury. Well, here we're going to zero in on the freshman class of 2024, the graduating class of 2028. And Immediately what we can see is that with the black student population, 14%, pretty much matches the 13.7% of the general population. But we have to bear in mind that the Supreme Court case pointed out that Harvard's admission standards were using race as a help for the admittance of black students to a very significant extent. So, but in general terms, one doesn't see, well, it's in line. It's aligned with the general population. The same is true with the Hispanics. Not as accurate, but 16% versus 19.5%. So that's quite reasonable, even if it's a bit low. What really stands out is the Asian American. That just really pretty much knocked me over. 37% versus 6.4% in the general population. 3 times exclamation points. Woo! Now, if we include the Native Americans, which are about 1% of the student population, but if we include these 4 categories and add them up, that comes up to 68% of Harvard's incoming class of 2024 fall into one of these 4 categories, which means there's only 32% left for white students, at most. And we compare that to the Euro-white population at large of 58.4%. And I'm thinking back to the Supreme Court case, which was decided in June 2023. Here we have the incoming class of 2024, and it looks like Harvard is not complying in any way with the Supreme Court decision that they are not in alignment, not in compliance with the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. This I'm trying to wrap my head around. I feel that have been drinking a lot of Trump's plunk. And in MAGA Donald Plunk Veritas. And this Veritas that Harvard might be defying a Supreme Court decision that says their admissions processes are unconstitutional is just making my head spin. And what I realize, or what I would suggest, is that what Trump and MAGA want to hear is to admit only white students until this imbalance is redressed, until this injustice is redressed. What I realized by looking at these statistics is that the white enrollment is not hurt by Hispanic or Latin or black enrollment. Those are quite in line with the population at large. It's really the Asian American students that are outperforming by several factors, several multitude. And really what needs to happen is that Harvard needs to reduce that percentage from 37% to 6.4% and give that percentage to the whites, and that will basically bring the whites up, and everything is in alignment. Now, one could argue, well, this would hurt their voters among Asian Americans. I don't know how Asian Americans vote, how many Democrats versus Republicans, but let's assuming that even all the Asian Americans vote Republican. I would surmise that they are, focused in the coastal areas, particularly California and the Northeast, and looking at this U.S. against Census Bureau data, we can exactly see that that's exactly where we're finding the Asian Americans. And so there's such blue areas that it's unlikely they would have any effect on the outcome of an election electorally. So quite easy for MAGA to hurt Asian Americans for the betterment of Euro whites. What's interesting is the Supreme Court case does not mention this discrepancy. They talk about the policies for blacks and Hispanics, and it seems that the effect of those policies is merely to raise the black enrollment up to match the general characteristics of the population, which doesn't seem to be so bad. Why single that out? I suspect that this is the focus of white Christian nationalism and their antagonism to particularly blacks. Well, that's Harvard. Is there a pattern of reverse discrimination against white students? Well, let's look at the other universities, see what we can find of those universities that were mentioned also as targets. We start with Columbia, right? 26% white. Cornell, 30%. Brown, 35%. Penn, Trump's alma mater. It doesn't split it out by group, but it does put it together, saying that 57% of their students identify as people of color, which means at best 43% can be white. And again, we compare this to 58.4% of the population at large, and we can see that this is a statistically significant difference. And they're also attacked over transgender policy. So yet another of the white Christian nationalist tenets coming into play here. I say it's a basket. Yale, 2,111 white students out of 6,814, making 31%. Princeton, bit of a funny one, right? The white part of this is actually pretty much in line with the national average. So I don't understand why they were specifically named, but all I can say, and I haven't done that research, but they are named, right? So should be okay. NYU, 21% white. George Washington, in D.C., and of course D.C. has a fairly substantial population of a certain ethnic minority. And I couldn't find the actual figures on the George Washington website, but this coming from their diversity and equity office, and we can start seeing already that they're going to be in trouble. We can predict that. So I am going to slip back into my MAGA brain, and even without the statistics, I'm just going to take a look at this, and what I'm seeing, I don't like. This does not look good. Johns Hopkins, 20% white. Northwestern, 43%. University of Minnesota, 61%. A little bit funny. Actually, it's slightly higher than what we would expect from the national average. Now, maybe as a state university, we should be looking at the state demographics. That might make more sense for a university such as Harvard. It probably does make sense to look at the national demographics, but perhaps the state should reflect more the individual state. So I didn't look at Minnesota's demographics specifically. However, from a MAGA point of view, this looks pretty good. Blacks and Hispanics are underrepresented. Asians are a bit overrepresented, but the whites are doing fine. So what is this about? And I can only surmise that because this is Minnesota, a blue state, turning kind of purplish actually, that it has a certain governor, Tim Walz, who ran for vice president of the United States. So I suspect that this is Trump making a bit of a political message. Right? Berkeley in California, also state university, and they do compare themselves to the state demographics, which I would suggest is fair enough. So looking at the state demographics, Hispanics of any race, again, Hispanic itself is not a race, but Hispanics are 39% of the population, even ahead of the whites at 36.6%. This surprised me. I still thought that whites would be ahead, but Hispanics are slightly ahead. And as we would expect with the American Asian population, given this is California, we expect it to be above the national average, and indeed it is by a factor of about 2.5 times, sitting at 14.5%. So that brings us to UCLA, a state institution. Whites account for 25%, which is both statistically under the California percentage for whites as well as the national. And the same for the University of Southern California, USC. Whites or Caucasian, so that's another term I could have used, coming in at 25%. So, I'm spinning again. Every university except 2, Princeton and Minnesota, but all the others, there seems to be a consistent pattern of underrepresentation of white students. This is a bit of a surprise to me. To come back to the premise we established at the beginning and to address Mr. Zakaria's statements, and particularly that there's no reason for retribution. Mr. Zakaria, if you see this video, I think we have shown to you that the white Christian nationalist, white supremacist filter works to explain the Trump-MAGA attack on universities. There is a reason. It's reverse discrimination. This white Christian nationalist, white supremacist lens or filter has never failed me to understand what is going on. And I think, at least I'm convinced, and perhaps that this has been informative for those of you who have been watching this, I am convinced this filter is spot on and can explain virtually everything that's happening in the lunacy of American politics. I will be following up with this theme. There'll be many more videos coming on this. So, my message to Mr. Zakaria, adopt this filter, get clued in. Just when I thought the coast was clear to go to final editing so I can post this to my Pillar on Politics YouTube channel, I came across this article. So, Harvard behind closed door, debating a truce with Trump. This article came out on June 24th, 2025, and Harvard, having been engaged in this devastating conflict, are now trying to figure out the conundrum of striking a deal without compromising their values. An alumni group further encouraged the university to not dilute our values. This is the full article. Of course, you can't read it. I can't. It's just about showing the length of the article and how many paragraphs there are. And as I was reading this article through, of course, I was thinking, based on what I've been saying before, what about these guys? They're hovering over everything. And reading this article, read through it, there is no mention of the Supreme Court of the United States ruling saying that Harvard was engaging in discriminatory admissions practices. Further, there was no mention of the DOE, the Department of Education, discrimination case against Harvard based on this ruling. And yes, America is a hugely bipartisan place, completely split with culture wars. And I'm realizing, or this is making me think, that the culture war has moved and embraced the rule of law. And I think what I'm seeing, or what I'm hearing, and what I'm concluding is that each side, left or right, are saying, you, the other side, have to abide by court rulings. Of course, the Democrats excoriate Trump for ignoring court rulings. But yet, coming from one of the bastions of, or so people would call it, a bastion of liberal thought, a bastion of the East Coast educated elite, basically saying, we're not following a Supreme Court ruling. Seems to be no discussion of this. I'm just keep on spinning. Because this seems to be what the state of affairs is. It seems to me that one of these vaunted or Harvard values is the ignoring of a Supreme Court decision. I just can't seem to come to any other conclusion. Thank you for watching this Pillar on Politics Context Cubed video. Thank you from a still spinning Bob Pillar. If this video, in fact, did help you to see that there was more context to this issue, context cubed, and you found this informative, yes, do hit the like button, do subscribe. There will be more videos coming from Pillar on Politics Context Cubed.